there you go. Yeah, system, you should have it under the display. Oh. Let's try to make the screen brighter. I'm not sure.
It's not a keyboard?
Sometimes there's a little sun on there.
That's what I was just thinking, the keyboard sun.
That's Mac.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, they have it on like the Chromebooks and stuff too.
One of these.
Yeah.
They could be on a display. Never.
Yeah, I said the one person now that we can.
You got something? So it's not under the display tab?
No.
That's interesting.
Well, is everyone doing well? Made it here, 8 a.m. Saturday. Arizona Christians. Were you here for the? You were here at the other conference, right? No.
I was there for some of it, my parents were.
Yeah. Okay. Ethan. I know Megan was. I'm gonna switch between standing up and sitting down. I normally would just stand up, but this computer's down here, so as I add things in, I'll sit down and then stand up. I think everyone knows me. My name is Owen Anderson, and I'll be team teaching this today. We also have Greg Goodrich. He's a professor of philosophy at Gateway Community College, and I'm at Arizona State University West Campus, which is just a mile down the road. Hey guys, come on in. Come on up front until we see how many we have.
While there's this interruption, I'm gonna try.
All Elvish speaking people should sit in the front.
Yeah, right.
We'll also be live online. Glad you could make it.
Glad to be.
Hey John, nice to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you.
Want to come up here by Greg? He doesn't bite.
No, I like that.
Like the back? All right.
You don't have a rebel.
You're all good. Caleb, was that thumbs up that we're good? All right, so welcome to General Revelation Institute's Spring Intensive 2022. And I have our outline on the board. Our general theme is that we're going to learn to show what is clear about the eternal power of God from general revelation. And that's one sentence, but I split it up into 3 parts because we'll be learning about each of those parts today. And we're going to be recording this if you'd like to share it with others in the future, or go back and revisit yourself. And our general outline will roughly stick to this. We're going to start by talking about something called biblical atheism. Biblical atheism. You might wonder what that is. That sounds almost like a contradiction. And we'll have a break in between each class. Next, why we need arguments. We're here to learn about how to show it's clear God exists, which gives you the sense that we'll be learning about arguments. So why do we need those? Aren't there better or other ways to approach knowing God? And what is an argument? Sometimes just that term sounds like a negative thing, right? Like something you do, more like bickering. No one likes to bicker. So why would we want to do that? So we need to learn what arguments are. And then 5 and 6 we'll get into arguments. The argument for clarity, that there must be some things that are clear, and the argument that something must be eternal. And those go together this way. We'll give the argument that something must be clear, and then we'll illustrate it with that very next argument. Here's an illustration of something that's clear. There must have been something from eternity. And then 7, the argument that matter is not what's eternal, and the argument that the soul is not eternal. And again, those two are related. So there's more to do than that. This is just our first intensive. We're going to have another one in July. Welcome. Another intensive in July as we plan on our September conference. So there's lots of good things to cover as we show that God exists. And that's where we're going to begin, is what exactly do we mean by God? So if you've been involved in apologetics or philosophy, you've read about giving proofs for God's existence. Have you ever tried to do that? Has anyone ever asked you, like, why do you believe in God? Or maybe you've wondered that yourself. Why do I believe in God? Do I have an argument? And you might have even heard counter arguments. Someone might have said, not only don't you have a good argument, but I have an argument to show there is no God. I'm going to sneeze here. Nope. Yep. Nope. So you might have proofs to show there is no God. And then maybe you just settle on, well, that's what you believe, and I have what I believe, and let's talk about something else. So it's never really settled or decided, and you see that in the world today. Lots of different beliefs about God, and if we can prove that God exists. And I would think, just speaking anecdotally, this is not based on any kind of scientific study, but it seems like knowledge of or belief in God is the less respectable between the two, intellectually. So people who say there is no God, that they're the intellectuals, and then people who aren't very educated think there is God. And then so you'll see books from Christian publishers sometimes, professors who believe in God, like it's an oddity. But it also is meant to be like, look, you can be smart and believe in God still, right? Which means that kind of book means you're already on the defensive, right? So we want to raise some questions about that whole approach. Is that true that belief that God, there is no God, is the one that has more proof? And what is involved in giving a proof? Is that really just for the intellectuals? Part of what we're doing at our General Revelation Institute is arguing that this is for everybody, not just for intellectuals. In fact, there might be a good argument made that the intellectuals have a harder time than most at getting it. Is that interesting? Is it kind of opposite of what you might think? But yeah, they might have some impediments to their understanding because they're intellectuals. They'll need a special other class for them, whereas other people say, yeah, I understand there are no uncaused events. That's pretty straightforward. So, proofs for God's existence. Now, the first thing that stands out to me in this sentence is the word God. Proofs for what? What is God? And that's not addressed a lot of times when you get into arguments for God's existence. What you'll find is proofs for an unmoved mover, uncaused event, a designer, a lawgiver. And then you'll find counter proofs against those. We can find law in a different way. There's actually not very much design. The world is filled with evil. I should say not uncaused event, uncaused cause. There are no uncaused causes. There's just universes all the way back. Same thing with unmoved movers. There are none of those. But even if you settle this point, to me, none of this looks like God very much. Maybe the last two start to hint at God, but you could have those without God. So what we want to do, I'm just going to begin with what I'll call a full definition of God. God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchanging, in being, wisdom, power, holiness, goodness, justice, and truth. That's taken from the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 4. And it has 3 parts. First part, God is a spirit, gets to the kind of substance God is. God is not material, God is immaterial, but immaterial is a negative word, just not material. What is God? Positively, well, God's a spirit, not physical, conscious, not made of matter. God doesn't have a body. So that gets into, anticipates the prohibition against idols. That's not what God looks like. God doesn't have a body. And then the second part of the definition is called the incommunicable attributes. It's these 3. God is infinite, which means that than which there is no greater. Eternal, which means without beginning or end. It doesn't mean merely without end, because when we go over this argument up here, the soul is not eternal, I inevitably get someone saying, so you believe the soul ends? No. Just that it had a beginning. It could go on forever. That's everlasting. And then infinite, eternal, unchanging. God's not growing or declining, celebrating a birthday. Hey, God's 130 years old. This is great. God doesn't complete his bachelor's degree and have a graduation party. God's infinite and therefore unchanging. And the idea is that these 3 incommunicable attributes all go together. You can't separate them and have an eternal but changing thing. And that's going to be the heart of the arguments in point 7 up here. Once you know something's eternal, you also know something's unchanging. And if you see an object and it's changing, you know it's also not eternal. Now you've done what's called an inference, and you're beginning to make arguments. This might be the day where you look back on, what time will it be? Say maybe in 30 minutes or so, and you say, that's the day I felt most human. Do you know why? It's the day I was making inferences the most in my life. And that's the most human thing to do, isn't it? Using reason. Let's say you go home and you find that your pet has made a mess on the rug. Do you give your pet a lecture about hygiene? And explain again sanitation to your pet? I don't think so. It's not, I mean, you could, but it wouldn't get you anywhere, would it? They don't reason. And even your computer, you might think, wow, but computers are so close to being intelligent. No, they're not. They have to be told exactly what to do. They can't do anything on their own. They're not smart at all. So you're going to start learning to make inferences. That's this number 3 up here. Why we need arguments. And I just gave you an example simply from the definition of God, how we can start to conclude matter's not eternal. Just by doing this first part, just by beginning with asking, what is God? Even before we get into proofs. So we know when someone says there is no God, they're saying this does not exist. And we have to ask the follow-up question then, well, what do you think is eternal? And if they're telling us something's eternal, but it's a changing thing, then we know they're involved in a contradiction. That's what we'll learn about today, how to show that. And the third part of the definition is this. These attributes or properties, because these are ones we can have also. It's just that God has them infinitely, eternally, and unchangingly, whereas we have them finitely, temporally, and changeably. But we can have being, wisdom, power, holiness, goodness, justice, and truth also. That's not unique to God. That's part of that. That's getting to what it means to be in the image of God. So 3 parts to the definition, and that's really what you want to do before you have any discussion with someone about, does God exist? Let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. So when I hear an atheist like Richard Dawkins speak, I hear him speaking about Zeus. So I would agree with him. Yeah, there is no God in that sense. No one like Zeus exists. But he doesn't get to what's eternal. Or ask what does he think is eternal? Does he have any proof for his belief? So to say there is no God, so atheism means no God as defined above. It simply is the word a, not theism. God. So lots of things that you might call religion can fall into atheism. Isn't that interesting? There might be many religions that are atheist religions. Atheism doesn't mean simply materialism. That might be how you've thought about it mostly, is the atheist is the guy who says there's just matter. That's all that exists. The best example of that guy is named Epicurus. There are no gods and there is no soul. There are no gods and there is no soul. Now, from there, I'm going to give you a hint of where the atheist goes. From there, you can conclude, do what you want is the whole of the law. You know where that quote's from? Do what you want is the whole of the law. Occultists would know. Right? People who like the occult. The Satanic Bible. But they're quoting it from Aleister Crowley, who I think is just getting it from Epicurus, adapting Epicurus. It's a cumbersome way of saying, do whatever you want. Maybe Journey said it better. Any way you want it, that's the way you need it. That's atheism in pop culture. Because it's not true that any way you want it, that's the way you need it. That's a way of saying this. Do whatever you want. Do whatever makes you happy. That's a rejection of God. But that's interestingly a very influential belief today, right? Do whatever makes you happy as long as it doesn't hurt others. They might add that in there. The Satanists might say, we're very peaceful. We don't want to hurt others. We just want to do whatever we want. Okay, well, we'll look at that and see. That's just called atheism, not Satanism. And we'll figure out why right now. So how do we know which one to believe? You might have a preference. The fact that you're here, and I know most of you, I know that you think this is true. No one's here who doesn't think that's true. But how do we show it? And I want to suggest that showing that God is real is the beginning of our fellowship with God. It's not simply about winning an argument or commanding many facts, of formally showing a proposition is true. There's this aspect of fellowship with God. A related term is communion with God. Now, it should be obvious to you that if you don't believe God is real, you don't have fellowship with God. But you could also believe God is real and not have fellowship with God. And I suspect it might be because you might say God is real, but you don't believe this about God. So, how do we have fellowship with God? Does that sound, I don't think anyone would say that's not good. Even the atheists, they might say, yeah, if God exists as you define God, that'd be a good thing. There just isn't anything like that. It's like saying it'd be good to have fellowship with Superman, but there isn't a Superman. Unless, the only caveat might be if they're hung up on the problem of evil. And they say, no, the God you're describing is actually wicked because of how we see the world. So that might be, we're gonna come to that. That's gonna be the July intensive, the problem of evil. That might be one you bring up today, right? Say, wait a minute, what about evil? Oh, don't worry, we'll go to that. So formally showing a proposition's true is usually what people do in the kind of arguments. I'm right and you're wrong. And there is something to that. You want to know this belief is true. But we're going to go further than that. We want to have fellowship with God. We want to see how atheism is really a denial of fellowship with God. Which means if you've argued against atheism, but you haven't come to fellowship with God, you haven't done much. You might have shown the atheist is wrong, but then you've come short yourself. So you're in the same boat. You have to go through to that next level. And I'm going to use some illustrations from David, James, and Paul and Jesus to show this is the case. You can't simply stop with thinking, well, I've proven there's an unmoved mover, so the atheist is wrong. Well, the demons know that. Didn't do them any good. You never had fellowship with God. So let's look at some specifics of biblical atheism. This is how the Bible describes the atheist. And Psalms 14 and 53 are well-known examples. It is a fool who says, in his heart, there is no God. Again, look at the parts of this. Fool, and it's in his heart, there is no God. So 3 parts to that I want to think about. Now, this is not simple name calling. Most of the time when we use fool, we shouldn't. It's name calling. So we say someone's a fool just because we're frustrated. That's not what's happening here. This is a description. There really is a condition of being a fool. And the fool is especially identified as the one who thinks he knows and does not know, but teaches others. So fool thinks he knows and doesn't know. And that's why you might have called someone a fool. If they come across as someone who thinks they know. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a fool. So this is the person who says in his heart there is no God. And this in his heart. That important? Is that just added in there? That refers to his inner thoughts. He may or may not say this. And so we live in an age where that's just said publicly. But there have been ages where you wouldn't admit to that publicly. But you live as if there is no God. And so the existentialists of the last century thought that it was kind of relieving to be able to just confess this in public. Just to be honest with everyone. Here's who I am. I don't believe there's a God. And they thought that was therapeutic. Rather than, so perhaps, I'm saying perhaps it might be better to be honest with what you think than to think it in the side but be forced to say something else in public. Maybe that's better, but those are both terrible options with regard to atheism. A third option would be the fact that you see this tension should make you say to yourself, maybe I'm wrong about this atheism, and rethink it. So in his inner thoughts, these are also the thoughts that are most dear to him. It's not the other way around. The thoughts we present to others, we might be lying about it. But our inner thoughts are your true self. This is who you are. And the fool says this, and it said there is no God. But we got to expand on that now, because that's not simply philosophical materialism. Today, most Christian philosophers think they've proven God exists if they show philosophical materialism is false. And that's simply not true. There's lots of other options. So let me Psalm 14 and 53 are very similar. So I'm just going to write about both of them here. But they do have differences that are worth reflecting on in a different setting. So it says in them, the Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone astray. They are all together become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. That's the next verse after this one about the fool. That's pretty powerful. That's an indictment. It's not that most people don't. None do good. And look at the order. Do any of them seek God and understand? No. And because of that, none of them do what is good. But it begins here, not the other way around. And a lot of times we go the other way. Someone will say, but there are moral atheists. There are atheists who will clean their neighbor's yard when they see it's dirty and help him fix his tire and donate to charities that feed the poor. Of course there are atheists who do those things. What are you talking about? Well, interestingly, I'm not talking about atheists here, and I don't, in that sense, materialists, and I don't think the psalmist is either. And he says all. This applies to the religious people also. We're going to talk about both the false philosophy and false religion. So I don't accept that whole paradigm in the first place, where you say, well, there are moral atheists. Yeah, you're already going in the wrong understanding of morality. Are there any atheists who seek God? Oh, of course not. Well, that's where the problem began. Not if you give to charity. And then he says, have all workers of iniquity no knowledge? Rhetorically, and the answer is no. And that's a strange one. You might wonder about that. Wait, so you're saying they don't know 2 + 2 is 4? I hope you see that's kind of missing the point of this psalm, but you get questions like that from people. I'll call them Facebook questions. That's the level of questions you get on Facebook. So you're saying they don't know 2 + 2 is 4. Well, the context is speaking about not understanding or seeking God. They know nothing about that. And really, therefore, any other knowledge they have won't benefit them at all. They can know that 2 + 2 is 4 and balance their checkbook, and it doesn't benefit them at all. So this is the beginning of how the Bible describes atheism. But there's more. In Psalm 36:1, the transgression of the wicked saith, again within my heart, that there is no fear of God before his eyes. So no fear of God. This is getting us to the fact that you can, I'm going to introduce a fellow to you. We'll name him Damon. And Damon believes there is a God, but he doesn't fear God. And that's biblical atheism. What does it mean to fear God? Well, since we've used this translation, the word fear in English has shifted. And we mean something usually more like craven fear, where you're cowering in the corner while Mike Myers and Freddy Krueger roam the halls. And you think, okay, so I have to fear God like that. God is fearful. This is more like awe and respect. The awe of God. But it does tend to fear in the sense that you realize who God is and who you are, and the insurmountable difference between the two. And it's fearful that God would even speak to you. And also that God is just and holy and you're not. And there's consequences for your not being holy. And God in his perfect justice upholds those consequences. That's fearful. We were told to fear God from the very beginning when we were told, the day you eat, you'll surely die. That should put the fear of God into you. So the atheist, the biblical atheist, does not fear God, does not see God's holiness and his own corruption, does not believe the day you eat, you will surely die. Sin always and immediately leads to death. So in this sense, our first parents acted as biblical atheists when they ate. And certainly the serpent is a biblical atheist. So we don't want to have a narrow argument where we think we show Epicurus that there's an unmoved mover. That's what philosophy gets a bad name for. And there's certain people that play Sudoku. There's other people who play with those cards Magic. There's Pokemon people. And there's these guys that get together and talk about if they're unmoved movers. And that's not useful to the most Christians, right? What's useful to all of us is how the Bible is describing that we should know God. And this whole thing that we're doing today should put the fear of God into us. If you left today and there was someone outside taking a survey and say, hey, what's one thing you came away knowing? Well, I've learned to fear God. That'd be good, right? I also said another one, which I'm fine with. I became human. Either one of those would be good. Follow up. That'd be funny on like Yelp or something. A Yelp review. I learned to fear God. But that's what we're doing in showing that God exists. We're not just playing mind games or doing logical puzzles. And then, he continues in Psalm 36 to say, God does not see, God does not hear, God does not act. So the person saying this, in some sense, says there is a God. He doesn't do anything. Instead of saying the opposite, the psalmist argues, the one who made the eye, does he not see? So he gives an argument against that. God sees the most. Our seeing is only a limited example of the perfection of seeing, which is what God does. Whereas the atheist is turning the other way around and making our seeing the standard and saying God doesn't even do that. And the same thing with hearing or acting. So you'll have a lot of the world's mythologies and a lot of your favorite stories involve some original deity who started things off and now he's distant, asleep, dead. The Babylonian original deity died and the other gods live in his carcass. So there's some recognition. Yeah, there was this guy, El. He made stuff, but where is that? I don't see him. He's not involved anymore. He left us on our own. We're here to fend for ourselves. And people still speak that way today when they talk about events in the world. They don't see the providential rule of God in each moment. That's what we should learn to recognize. Otherwise, we might be flirting with biblical atheism. If we mostly think in terms of human causes or national causes, international conflicts, and we don't see God's rule in the world, well, then we're flirting with the same thing. We're saying it's not God, it's something else. Or God's kind of standing back and watching humans do their thing. Instead of saying, no, God's actively involved in ruling for his purposes. And so by contrast, look at Psalm 111. The psalmist praises God for all his mighty works. And he goes through a list of those. The mighty works of God. And he ends in verse 10 with the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And a good understanding have all they that do his commandments. His praise endures forever. So there's going to be a connection now. The biblical atheist is explaining why he doesn't have to keep God's commandments. Oh, I don't need to keep God's commandments because God's asleep, God's dead, God's distant, there is no God. One of those, right? So I should do what I want to make myself happy. Or I should do what my local deity tells me to do, the God of my group, not the God who created all things. So there's a connection between the fear of God and keeping his commands. And I think you'd see that naturally in terms of fear of getting a punishment for wrongdoing. Do you fear speeding? I bet you speed, don't you? Because you know the limitations of enforcing the speed limit. And you can kind of look around and see, I don't think there's any speed traps here, pedal to the metal, and you're going. Or you might not do that, but you might have like a 10-mile over rule, right? 45 really means 55. So there's not a fear of speed enforcement in you. And that'd be an example. Do you fear breaking the commands of God? Or you think, well, God's probably not paying attention this time. No one's around, including God, so I could get away with it. Well, that's not fearing God. That's biblical atheism. The truth of the matter is, back up here to the definition of God, God is infinite. God is just. God knows all. God does care about what you do. That's interesting because the biblical atheists will say, why does God care what we do when it comes to them doing wrong things? But then when something goes wrong, why doesn't God care about us? It goes both ways, right? Well, no, one or the other, buddy. You can't have both. God does care about you so much that he cares that you don't sin because he wants you to be good. So, Psalm 111. And then, I mentioned this already, but just keep in mind James 2:19, when you might meet a clever fellow who says, he can prove God exists, but you know his life's not in order. James says, you believe that there is a God. Good. Remember Damon? The demons believe that and shudder or tremble. So at least they do have some response of, man, this is a powerful enemy that I have. It's not enough, but it's some response compared to the guy who's just like, turning God into a logical puzzle. I did Sudoku in the morning. I read Thomas Aquinas in the afternoon and saw there is an unmover. And then I drank myself into oblivion at night. No real effect on his life. So if you believe there's a God, James is exhorting us to the same thing the psalmist did here. Keep the commands of God then. You claim to have faith, but you don't live. as if you have faith. Your faith is dead. So some people worry that James is a book of works. It's not. Or it is. It's both in different senses. James is reminding us that there's a connection between our beliefs and our actions. And he's also reminding us that there's something called self-deception. So we might say we believe something, but we're not living that way, which calls into question that we don't really believe it. And then the last example right now for a biblical atheist is from Jesus in John 14. Jesus never dealt with simple, straight-up Epicureanism or simple, straight-up philosophical materialists. You don't find him bumping into a guy who says, hey, Jesus, you can't be the Son of God because only atoms exist. The closest in the New Testament might be Paul when he goes to Athens in Acts 17 and talks to the Epicureans there. But Jesus doesn't deal with those, but he deals with people who qualify as biblical atheists nonetheless. And John 14 is a good example. You believe in God, believe also in me. These can't be separated, I'm going to argue. If you argue God exists and you come short of affirming who Christ is, you don't know God. You haven't given a proof of God. You've given something else. And so Thomas, he tells the disciples, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going. Show us the way. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Not one of the ways. I am a way. I am the way. You can't come to the Father except through Christ. And that includes with arguments. And you might be surprised at that because you say, well, I thought we're coming here to learn about arguments to come to God. Well, arguments to come to God through Christ. You can't come to God apart from Christ. And if you think you've done that, but you've rejected Christ, you're in the role of the Pharisee, who was much more religious than you, so you're actually in worse shape than the Pharisee. Because at least they kept the commands so well. I'm not only speaking when I look around and say you, and you think, oh, he means me. No. We got audience online also, we got future watchers. You, the audience, don't want to be with the Pharisees for this reason. They didn't make it, and they did better than you. So you're definitely not going to make it, if that's your plan. So there must be a different plan. So then he says, if you'd known me, you would have known my Father also. I've been with you so long, how have you not known me? Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also. And the works I do so the Father may be glorified. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. So do you hear the psalm there? Back up to Psalm 111. If you know God, those who fear God, keep his commandments. And now you might say, whoa, the New Testament is about love. The Old Testament was about fear. Well, no. In the Old Testament, we're also told to love God. To seek God. To seek what is good. Amos chapter 5 says both those. Seek God and seek what is good and hate evil. So we're to love Christ and keep his commandments, which he's identifying with God's commandments. And this brings up a topic we'll discuss later, love of God. If we love God, we would seek God. If we seek God, we would find him. We would understand his eternal power and divine nature. If we find him, we would keep his commandments. because we understand who's giving them. So see how those three go together? I'm starting to get you into arguments now. I'm warming you up. Those three all go together. And this is true about love. Think about love and what you love. Things you love doing. You want to do them as much as you can. And you probably know a lot about them. If I was to ask you questions about it, you'd be able to tell me all kinds of things about whatever it is you love. And so when we put up someone saying, I love God, next to the fact that they can recite every Pokemon power, see, well, it doesn't seem to add up. I think of a more mature example for this group on. But you get the point. It doesn't add up. You know all about this. You know very little about God at all, but you say you love God. And that certainly doesn't translate in the romantic relationship sense of love. When you're in love with somebody, you don't even think they have any blemishes. You just extol all the things that are great about them. In the human level, that starts to fade when you do realize, oh, this person's a human. They have faults. And that fades. With God, that would never fade. So God, if we love God, we'd seek God. And we can ask ourselves that. What do I do to seek God? That's different than the Pharisees. The Pharisees might say, I keep his commands, but they don't understand God. Especially in John 14, that would apply to them. He's talking to the disciples there, but that would apply to them. You don't know me, so you don't know the Father. You don't understand. You've kept certain outward commandments, and I want to make sure you distinguish between outward commandments and God's law. Those are different. You've kept certain outward commandments, but you haven't understood the purpose of them, which were to point us, the Old Testament law was to point us to Christ. You didn't understand that, and so you weren't seeking God. So the biblical atheist, we want arguments against biblical atheism. We can find them in the scriptures, but we already know them, or we can know them, say, general revelation. Because I think when the Psalms tell us this, they're building on general revelation. When the Psalms tell us to fear God, that's a general revelation truth. Everyone should fear God. Even if they don't have the Bible, you should fear God from general revelation. So that's what we're going to be doing. This is kind of a summary of our general purpose at the General Revelation Institute, and also the focus for the rest of this morning. So we'll pause there. We'll have a little break, and then we're going to pick back up with what exactly are arguments and why do we need them. All right?
The argument for arguments.
Argument for arguments. Wait a minute.
That's what it's called. Chapter 1 of the new book.
Yeah.
The argument for arguments. Yep.
Is it only here?
No, it came out in paperback too.
Oh, okay.
It was a couple days later. It's Amy's
No,
birthday.
we saw it. We saw it in there, and then it went somewhere, it disappeared, so, well, we hope so. So it's,
like a little mini one, not a big one.
yes, it was like a tiny little Lego piece, it wasn't even like a block, it was like one of these little things.
Oh, gosh, okay. Oh,
So,
that's wonderful.
it doesn't hurt, he doesn't, it doesn't
Still maybe.
All right, let's begin. We'll go back up here and remind you of the outline. Categorize this. So now we're going to talk about why we need arguments. Why do we need arguments? Which is a funny way to put that is that we're going to give an argument for arguments. And I have a book out. I wanted to bring it today, but the paperback didn't come out in time. And it's called The 12 Arguments. How to Show What's Clear About God from General Revelation. And the first chapter is titled this, An Argument for Arguments. That's the first argument of the 12. Why do we even need arguments at all? So let's talk about that a little bit. Why do we need arguments? Now remember back up to our last talk and how we began with, does God exist or not? What question did we ask right away? What do you mean by God? We can't jump into this, is it true or false God exists without knowing what's meant by God? So we define God. Well, that's the same thing we'll have to do here. What are arguments? What is an argument? And really, I want to go back a little bit before that and ask this question. What is philosophy? I'm going to give a definition from Peter Vermigli. If you've been on my YouTube page, you'll see a lecture on this a few weeks back. Peter Vermigli, Reformed theologian. And he said, philosophy, we often define philosophy as the love of wisdom from the word itself, philosophia. But he said it's also seeking to be clear or clarity, having clarity. And that's from a related term, philosophia, if you haven't, Saphia here, which he said he thinks are related in the Greek. So being wise, at least you can see it this way. If you say you're wise in some field, say you're really wise at plumbing and someone says, oh good, I'm down here, can you hand me the monkey wrench? Say, which one's that again? Well, that's just the basics, right? You don't know the basics about a clear difference between a crescent wrench and a monkey wrench. Well, then you're not wise in plumbing. So you're in any field, you'd want to have clarity of what things are. Right? Imagine you have a plumber come over and I found your problem, I fixed it. Oh good, you took care of the downstairs bathroom that was leaking? No, I fixed the upstairs one. There wasn't a leak at all. Well, you didn't get the right problem. So you weren't wise. You weren't able to solve the problem. So we need clarity, and that's what arguments are aiming at. An argument aims at clarity. We want to clarify or be clear about the terms in the argument, about the premises in the argument, and about how we infer the conclusion from the premises. I've just finished making an online logic class. If you've been to our webpage, you know that we offer free online classes. And we're currently offering one on God and morality. The next one up will be on logic. So today we're not going to get into a lot of details about inferences. But just know that we do offer that resource, so that'll be out probably in May. And you can take that for free and you'll learn a lot of the nuts and bolts of logic. And what I liked about as I was making these videos, what I was thinking, what's better about my class than the one I took is just this much. Not that I'm a better teacher, but you can pause the video and rewind it. When I was taking logic class, it was live. You can't pause this instructor, right? So it gets technical, but it's a video, so you can stop it, go back and say, wait, what? What did you just say? And go at your pace. Because honestly, I think when you get into logic, if it's intimidating at first, once you get past that, you get into it, it's really interesting how ideas relate and work together. So that's coming out. That's on, I should put a few of our web pages up here because that's on courses.generalrevelation.com. All those are online for free. And then there's also generalrevelation.com where we have our blog and posts for our conferences coming up. So notice three things here. Terms, premises, and conclusions in an argument. And we want to be clear about each of these. So that's what philosophy is concerned about in general. You'll find philosophers doing that, talking about ideas, trying to clarify what ideas they had in mind, what your ideas are, what my ideas are, and especially about basic questions. And when Greg comes up here and tells us about why something is eternal, he'll explain why our most basic concept is about eternal. So we'll come to that in a little bit. In other words, philosophy begins with that question. What is real or eternal? And that's to distinguish philosophy from false philosophy or worldly philosophy. We're told about this in Colossians. You might remember Colossians specifically warning 2:8. Beware, lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. All right, so imagine what that means. Some people read this just as beware of philosophy, period. Because it says cheat you through philosophy. Anderson's a philosopher, so he's going to try to cheat you. Now, that person who says this needs to take my logic class. Because what they've done is treated a particular predicate as if it was a universal predicate. Fallacy of overextension. Wish I could learn about that one. Say, I don't know what you're even saying right now. Good, that's what the whole point is. Just by knowing how predicates work, you could avoid that mistake. And you know, well, he's talking about particular philosophy, namely what's according to the traditions of men and the basic principles of this world, not according to Christ. So I hope you see how that builds on the previous hour. You can't come to God without Christ. If you're giving arguments for God's existence, they have to bring up the reality of sin and need for redemption, which is only accomplished in Christ. To have fellowship with God, you'd have to have Christ. And so this is a critique, and it's a correct critique of what is called the God of the philosophers. An unmoved mover, an uncaused event. And they'll say how different that is than the God of the Bible. Yes, but then they make this mistake and they'll say, therefore you need the Bible. the philosophers used general revelation, and that's all they got. You say, no, the philosophers didn't use general revelation. It was a bare minimal use of general revelation. So say God of the philosophers verse God of the Bible, but then make the mistake of thinking the philosophers used general revelation rather than the philosophers failed to see what is clear. That's why I said the last hour that the philosophers, the intellectuals, maybe have a particular impediment rather than a benefit. So we have false philosophy. And we can challenge it and show it as false with an argument. Remember the psalmist did this? God doesn't see. And he gave an argument. If God made the eye, then he sees. And God made the eye, therefore he sees. So you'd have to question the premise. No, God didn't make the eye. Or you could make the eye but not see. But once you show that's true, and I like that he picked eye of all the things, because the eye is important later in Darwinism. Darwin writes about how the eye could cause his theory problems. And he didn't know how detailed it was compared to us now. And it's what intelligent design people have focused in on, the eye, because you can't get an eye a little bit. It doesn't have any benefits to survival. You either have an eye or you don't have an eye. And of all the parts working together, you can't just like have them in a bag and shake up the bag and throw it out and an eyeball rolls out. So that turns out to be an important piece. Still, the fact of the eyeball and how it works. Now, I don't think the psalmist is speaking specifically about that, but I'm just telling you how these trains of thought still work. Could blind chance have produced the eye? No. The eye was made, created by God. And what the atheist was saying in the psalm was that specifically God doesn't see, he doesn't know what's going on. God's unaware. And so the psalmist is giving an argument back. So false philosophy. So think about the anatomy of an argument. I'm going to give you a formal anatomy and then we'll fill it in. All right? All S. Let me think about which variables to use here. I'm gonna trip myself up by using, say, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is the standard one. I was trying to put it all MRS, all PRM, all SRP.
What do you mean, PRS?
Yeah, wait. These two. All. This is being counterproductive for my purpose. I need to get the variables right, though. That would get it right. Say mortal, Socrates. All right, so the anatomy of an argument. You have terms here, and any argument, these are called syllogisms, categorical syllogisms, has three terms. men, in this case mortal or Socrates, or the technical variables here are the subject and the predicate of the conclusion. So here it's Socrates immortal. And then what is called the middle term, which is why M is used, middle term. Because what happens in an argument is these two terms that are in the conclusion were related to each other in the premises. So there's a relationship described in two premises, and from that you draw a conclusion. You make an inference about their relationship to each other. Or it could be their not relationship to each other, because the relationship could be that they don't have one. That's a negative premise. This happens to be a positive one. So all arguments have this in common. Are relating two terms to each other based on their relationship to a third term. So from the two premises, an inference is drawn. That's the conclusion. And this act of making an inference is one of the acts of reason. And I joked about that in the last segment to say, that will be when you feel they are human. Animals have sensations and intuitions and instincts. When you have those, you're not yet distinguishing yourself from an animal. And some humans only live out of that level. You could just stay at that level your whole life. You might have humans who are aspiring to be in the vegetative state their whole life. Right? You just find them kind of just sitting on the couch with Dorito dust. Right? Vegetables absorb nutrients also. I don't know, right? And they grow, but that's about it. So when you're being a human, you're using reason. You're distinguishing yourself from minerals, vegetables, animals. Did you ever play a game 20 questions and it'll say mineral, vegetable, animal, none, human? You're reasoning. You're drawing inferences, and so that's a particular thing that you're getting to do at the level of arguments. To get to inferences, though, we need to be clear about the terms, what it is referred to, and the premises. Is this correct? See how you're building up to doing arguments? So all of that is to say, that's what we need to do about God. Giving an argument for God's existence. Now, what about false religion? Going back now, we talked about false philosophy. How about false religion? Because we don't want to think that it's religion versus philosophy. That's not what Paul was doing in Colossians chapter 1. False religion, I don't know if you had to say which one's worse. They're both pretty bad. False religion might be the worst one if you had to pick. It might be better to be around an honest materialist than a Pharisee, if you had to pick. Not that they're both, either one's good. But in Amos 5, we're told God says he hates their religious observances and sacrifices. This is to the Jews in Jerusalem, where they're supposedly keeping his commands. They were told to do this, they supposedly are doing it, and God hates it because they aren't actually seeking God. They don't understand. And again, just like the Pharisees in the time of Jesus, they keep the sacrifices of the temple, but they don't know who Jesus is. Well, wait a minute. You've been observing Passover and the Passover lamb, the Lamb of God, all these years. You've been observing the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, and you don't know who the true Lamb of God is? Then you don't know God. And that's what Jesus says to them, and that's when they particularly get upset. If you don't know me, you don't know my Father who sent me. You don't understand. And that's why I've been emphasizing that theme this morning. We're coming to have fellowship with God through understanding. Remember, our motto is by faith we understand, from Hebrews 11. Faith is not blind belief, it's understanding. And Hebrews 11 begins with this. God formed the world. Only God is eternal. And we fear God because of who He is and because we have violated His law. So from there, we get to our need for Christ. We can't just keep it in the abstract about who God is. So we have false philosophy and false religion, and we want to avoid both, not just be worried about false philosophy. So what are some alternatives to arguments? What do people rely on instead of forming beliefs, putting them together, drawing a conclusion? Well, they might rely on, I mentioned earlier, intuitions, kind of immediate feelings, right? You might rely on, this is like a gut feeling. And sometimes your gut feelings are wrong. Are right. They're right just enough the way that a gambler's intuitions are right. Just enough to keep the gambler gambling and the house can take his money. So people will say, yeah, my intuitions, they're spot on. You look into it, turn out, no, they're not actually spot on. You have selective memory. You're only remembering the times. There was this one time, and it was an amazing story, so then you think your intuitions are always right. I walked right into the casino, put a quarter in, pulled the handle, and I won $100. The first machine I saw. It's amazing. I've got great instincts. Where's the $100 now? Oh, I lost that at poker. But the first machine I saw. So intuitions. How about tradition? And this is where you could have religious tradition. I've always believed in God. Well, good. The demons believe too. They've always believed in God, apparently. Remember this guy, Damon? He'll be our standout example, Damon. I've always believed in God. Yeah, a lot of people say that, right? Did you understand God? Now to some people that sounds surprising. You can never understand God. Well, you misunderstood. You think I mean comprehensively, like you understand all. You don't even comprehensively understand anybody. No, but you understand even the first things about God. When you say this, I've always believed in God. Did you always? I think we could prove this true because you're saying, yeah, since I was a little baby. Well, we'll go up to the little babies that claim to always believe in God. Do they believe these things about God? Well, I believe there's a higher power. Yeah, I know. You were conditioned to believe there's a higher power because when you were a baby, you were in your crib, and you'd be uncomfortable and you'd cry, and a huge figure would hover over you and relieve your discomfort and then go away. And you grew up, and that was your religion. And then, as you became a teenager, you realized that when you cry out to this huge higher power, it doesn't relieve your discomfort. So then you became angry and bitter at it and said, now I hate that higher power. Why won't it help me? So that's just Freudian conditioning. Freud describes all of that whole process. That's not getting to you knowing God. How about, this one might seem odd, informal fallacies. Pseudo-arguments, and I'm going to have Greg talk about this here now. A pseudo-argument means there are people who give arguments, they're just not actually sound arguments. This is aimed at persuasion, not truth. And a lot of people they stumble there because they'll say, well, I gave a sound argument and the people weren't persuaded. That's what you should expect. Read the book of Acts. Paul goes to Athens, gives a sound argument. Some of them mock him, and some of them say, we want to hear more. So I'm not suggesting that if you drop an argument on people, the whole crowd agrees. That has to do with their own subjective development. where they're at. But most of the arguments you see, and the example I do in my classes is I say, bring in 10 examples from ads. Because almost without exception, every advertisement is an informal fallacy. And I think that was actually the very first, or close to the first episode of Mad Men, which is about Madison Avenue marketers in the 60s. And John Hamm's character, they were being hired by Lucky Strike cigarettes to make an ad. And it was right after the Surgeon General had first issued the warning against cigarettes. So the Lucky Strike idea people were saying, what we need to do is say, our cigarettes have been proven to cause less cancer than the other cigarettes. Like ours are the healthy cigarettes. And John Hamm's character said, that's a terrible argument, first off. Right? Like, we'll kill you less than the other guys. But really, people don't smoke for that reason. And his idea was this. You just have a picture of a guy smoking and looking satisfied, and the line says, life's hard. Because that's why people smoke. You might die in the car on the way home today. You'll have an argument with your spouse. You'll go to a job you don't hate. Life's hard. You don't care if you're going to get cancer in 30 years. You just care about getting through the day. And he's right. That's a good ad. Right? People bought cigarettes because life's hard. That's a pseudo-argument, though. You don't really, it's not even an argument in one sense. It's a pseudo-convincing statement, right? It doesn't give you premise, conclusion. So I'm gonna have Greg talk to you about some of these, and then transition. We'll have our break, and then he'll get into our next argument as well about what is eternal.
So I'm a Mac guy, and I'm intimidated by the PC keyboard. So I'm going to write up on the whiteboard as needed and go from there. But I'm seeing it appears that they were learning some psychology in here before. We've got the id, ego, and superego. Yeah, to get to this point about informal fallacies, I, for one, was convicted, especially by the first segment Dr. Anderson just gave us, the biblical term of fool. We still have the ideas in our being, and to purge those is to be able to identify what is it that's tripping us up, what is it that's distracting us. And so the way that I was thinking about this visually as Dr. Anderson was presenting it, we have obviously the idea of the logos, or the giving an account of something, or the word. And we have that in John 1 as the eternal word of God, and that proceeds from God. It is God. It is a person in Christ. And so out of that, of course, we're going to have everything, every element, every aspect of life relating back to that word, back to that logos. Everything is going to be a revelation, general revelation of God. And so we have the logos, and as Dr. Anderson's put up here, we have intuitions. Intuitions. How do we make sense of our intuition in light of our humanity or tradition? Here we might also say culture, right? Culture is not a bad thing, generally speaking. It's a human element as we're connected together. We might also say science, right? So we have these elements of who we are as mental beings. We need meaning. And we don't just need meaning, off trying to contemplate God, who's in another distant realm, and the revelations that he's given of himself are up there. No, the revelations are all around us. And so these should be interconnected into our understanding in the logos. And we see that with university. It's to be bringing all or universe, right? It's bringing all these versions or elements of life and bringing them to focus on the core. What is that core? What is the perhaps here we'd say, what is the being from which all things proceed, right? So we'll talk about the eternal from that perspective. But as we look at informal fallacies, these are aimed at persuasion and not truth. And so we want truth about these things. How should I understand my intuition? I had, tax season is upon us, and so I was talking to an accountant recently, and she was talking with me about, gut feelings, and we got to trust our gut feelings. And I thought, okay, maybe that's a good thing for an accountant to say to me. I'm not sure, but we have intuitions, and those need to be made sense of, but they can trip us up. And we could be wrong. What sorts of life experiences do you experience that in? Or tradition and culture. Now, there's a big informal fallacy here. We see in tradition and culture, we can give way to appeal to authority. And an appeal to authority is where a supposed authoritative figure is speaking about something about which they're not an authority. So you may have a scientist speaking about philosophy, or you may have a scientist speaking about religion, as we just heard about Freud, right? He's analyzing behavioral elements, conditioning from our earliest days, but there's so much about belief that he's not engaged with. He's not understanding that. So we may often see scientists claiming things about things that they shouldn't be speaking on. These are the fools, the ones that are referring to what cannot be perceived at the beginning of time. Right? How did the universe come to be? That may come up. Others here may be ad populum, and I don't mean that this just comes out with tradition and culture, but when we think about our culture and the people that we're growing up with, well, so many people believe this, or so many people don't believe this. And that can be psychologically damaging to a person. But you think about figures like Jeremiah, who held his ground, understanding his relationship with God, and that was in the midst of a generation that had turned away from the Lord. Also, you might have common sense. So, common sense may be similar to intuition. Intuition might, you might see this in art, right? It takes the sign to be the reality. Within various religious traditions, you might have rites or sacraments like baptism or circumcision or some other, handshake or something, and that means you're in. Does it mean that you're in with God because you had some water sprinkled on you? Or immersion? Should it be immersion? Does it matter how the sign is given? So we can have all sorts of arguments based upon this. This is to say the sign, baptism or circumcision, is the reality. That is, you have a real living relationship with God. You have a new heart to understand. That doesn't follow. The sign does not mean that the reality is immediately present at that time. So we can get tripped up on that. And again, remember, that's not just individually, but we have entire communities that build up and reinforce, right? Everyone around me knows, or everyone around me believes this. And so then we'll have within Christianity so many groups. Why? Because we have persuasions that we're not focused on the truth. We're not focused on considering the meaning of things. And then in common sense, as I wrote here, this would not be the sign is the reality, but an appearance is the reality. So you're flying into Hawaii if you're maybe privileged. I have not had that privilege. But you're flying into Hawaii, and as you descend, you're seeing the change in the color of the water. Now, is the water actually changing color? No. No, it's just the position of the perceiver that's changing. So you may say, oh, it appears to me that the world is flat. It's not. There's a Netflix documentary. It's really interesting how it ends. It's kind of like a gotcha. Yeah, so common sense being that we often take ourself and our position with respect to reality to be absolute. And so if you disagree with me, you're just so far from any vague truth. There's nothing there. And so I may treat you like an idiot. What you're saying may seem so absurd to me because it's not common. And so we look around at, again, the people around us. We say, well, what is common to us? It's just common that you should know what a monkey wrench is, right? Why are you handing me a crescent wrench? So these are informal fallacies, and as we think about the particulars of challenges in our day and what we might get persuaded by, we may be persuaded by evolution, we may not be persuaded by evolution, but that's coming out in science and it's being taught within our schools, and that's with a position called empiricism, and that being very closely related to appearance is reality. Okay, so you have these sort of meshing together and reinforcing one another. So tradition and culture and science through common sense. You look at the bones, you look at the data. How am I on time? You look at the data, and it just says that these things are related, right? Look at the primates. Look at us. You see any similarities? I mean, have you ever looked into their face? Look at their eyes. Can't you just feel the connection? So you got maybe some intuition coming in here too. And all of that reinforces this idea, again, that there's a relationship between us and them, that is the primates, and we have now come from them, and they came from other, and then you go back all the way to the first life, right? Why? That life came from non-life. Well, maybe life and non-life are not so different. And maybe being and non-being are not so different. So empiricism is going to connect with the senses and putting emphasis on the senses, that we know through the senses, and we know through the senses only. And what we're doing here this morning is the exact contradiction of that. That you need to question whether or not you know anything through your senses. And in fact, you know all things by reason, through argument. But when I was 3, I was like learning what circles were and what squares were, and they don't fit into the same holes. Right? That's what we were doing. Wasn't that sense? It was oriented with the senses. But think about what you know. What would be something that you know? Do you often take what you think you know to be true, and by that divorce yourself from what might be a means to coming to understand reality? How many times do you have to hit a block wall before you realize the wall's not going to move? Reality is not going to change or conform to what you think of it. And so here we get this idea of humility. That I might think that I know through my senses. So we see a culture around us that thinks they know a lot of things through their senses, with not very much humility, and how many times are we going to run into the block wall? How many times until we realize this is not what is real? What is real, again, proceeding from the Logos. This is what's true. The Logos. By him all things were made. Can you know that much from general revelation? Well, you would have to begin with, again, this idea of what you can know through reason and argument, not what you can know by your senses, or not what others have already believed around you. Not what may be, even within a tradition, you're going to have a chieftain, right? You're going to have a chief, you're going to have a pope, and that person is going to be the voice of God, right? Ongoing revelation being given through this individual. And then that person may be raised up to a certain level, and you may have individuals appealing to that individual. What's going on there? Are they appealing to the Logos? No, they're appealing to another finite person who may or may not be a true representative of God. And that's going to cause you problems if you bought into this idea that this individual, the Pope, has a foundation that could be a firm foundation in my life and a firm foundation in culture. Especially when you go to something like Acts 15 and you see, okay, well, this teaching is supposed to be upon the basis of Acts 15. Acts 15 being the apostles' teaching, that the sign is not the reality, that baptism is not salvation through Christ. Or excuse me, that if you're baptized, that you are saved through Christ. When the apostles are not saying that. I may have scrambled my words there. Let me speak a little bit more clearly. So Acts 15, you have a challenge of the zealots, the Judaizers, coming and saying, you're saved by circumcision. Okay? That's the sign for that day. The sign in our day may be baptism. You're saved by baptism. Do we have those that are saying that? Yes. The Catholic tradition is saying that. And so then do we say, oh, well, that's what the apostles said, or that's what other individuals said? Well, we go back and we look at what was said. No, you're not saved through the sign. The sign and the reality are distinct. And then you have a tradition that's built up that says, no, the sign is the reality. But we're building on those guys. Well, those two things don't work. They can't interconnect. You can't say, I'm going to build on this foundation and then build over here and say, I'm building on that foundation. It's not the way it works. So if you're going to build on the apostles' teaching, you have to understand the sign is not the reality and build on it that way. And this is just within the realm of Christianity. Of course, we can look at many religious traditions and see the same sorts of things. So I hope this was helpful in just identifying, again, these are elements of our humanness, our mannishness, as some philosophers or theologians might call it. And they're proceeding as we were created by our Creator. They're proceeding ultimately from that Creator, and we should be able to make sense of them. But in our mind, when we're not focused on reason and argument, when we're not concerned with meaning, of course we say we are. We're that fool that says in his heart there's no God. We go astray, and that comes out in these informal fallacies. And it becomes a poison to us in our daily lives as we think one thought after another. It becomes a poison to others when we speak and behave in the same way as it comes out of our thinking. And so we want to go back and we want to take those informal fallacies captive and show, yeah, I'm ultimately concerned with persuasion. I've not been concerned with truth. And that's going to be the crux of it. At that point, we need to crucify that old life of being persuaded by something other than what's rational, and only then can we find meaning. Okay. So I think now is a good time to break, so we'll break for 10 minutes and then come back and begin to talk about what's eternal, I think. Okay.
Put them up on our webpage also once we're all done here. And you can follow through as a kind of outline of what we did and remind you of the topics. And then, of course, you can always feel free to email me questions. Let me put my email up here. Now, what we're going to do now, are we okay, Caleb? What we're going to do now is get into some arguments, which is what you might have expected. Say, well, this is a day we're going to learn about arguments to show God exists. Well, let's do that. So we're going to talk about clarity and eternal now. And I'll remind you down here, we spoke about arguments and the idea of making inferences. So that's what an argument does. We start with a conclusion, let's say. So we have a conclusion. God exists. And then someone says, how do you know that's true? And you give premises to support the conclusion. That's an argument. And it's worth your time to figure out sound arguments and unsound arguments. And that's why I mentioned that online class, they'll be available. There's much more than we'll go into on a day like this, but we'll give you some arguments now that will hopefully get you interested in that. Because just because someone has premises doesn't mean that the premises actually show the conclusion is true, right? A valid argument is one where the conclusion does follow from the premises, meaning if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. That's the relationship, and I showed you that above. I illustrated it with M, P, and S. You're relating terms to each other. So let's talk about clarity. Now, when we want clarity, we are using reason as the laws of thought, like identity, which says A is A, and non-contradiction, not both A and non-A. And just look at those. Right? There's a clear difference between A and non-A. That's clarity. What we might use for our purposes, though, because those variables might be hard to relate to, like A, what does that stand for? Do you mean an indefinite article? What is that? What about God and non-God? Is that a clear difference? Like if we were to go around the room and I held up objects, could you tell me if they're God or non-God? Hopefully you know ahead of time that that's just the wrong method, right? Everything you pick up will be non-God. What if nothing is clear? What if you can't make any distinctions? Here's another one. Man and non-man. I mean the generic use. Mankind. Man and non-man. Are those clearly different? Greg gave a good example of an anthropologist who was saying, yeah, when I look into the eyes of a chimpanzee, I see my relative. And he'd say, wait a minute, that's actually my uncle. That's not a chimpanzee. Oh, whoops, sorry. Move on to the next one. What are you looking at exactly, right? How do you know if it's a man or a non-man? What is distinguishing man from non-man? If you don't know that, if it's just blurred, then you can't speak intelligibly about mankind. Or how about good and non-good? Are those clearly different or not? That's clarity. That's using reason, the laws of thought. And so the first argument was a little funny, the argument for arguments. And the idea is this. If we don't have an argument, we don't understand. I'm going to actually copy and paste this up above. And I think you'd see how that's true in many areas of life. If someone says, I understand taxes, and you say, oh good, will you do mine? Oh no, I can't do taxes. I just understand them. Well, there's a disconnect there, right? Show me you understand. No, I can't show you I understand. I just understand. Hey, I've got a leaky faucet. I'm a great plumber. I understand plumbing. Oh, good. I've actually got a leaky faucet. It's really annoying. Can you fix it? No, I can't show you I understand plumbing. So I could multiply examples like that. You see the point though, right? I know God. Oh, good. Show me you understand. Oh, I can't show you that. Imagine, I was using two like object examples. Imagine a person though. Someone says, oh yeah, I know Kanye. Good. I mean, can you show me who Kanye is? No, I can't show you who he is. Well, I'll give you some pictures. Can you point out Kanye? No, I can't. But you know Kanye? Yes. Well, it doesn't make any sense. So someone says, I know God. Or I know God doesn't exist. It could go either way. Oh, good. You know who God doesn't exist. Tell me about God then that doesn't exist. Oh, I can't explain that. So if you don't have an argument, you don't understand. Now, if you leave today, remember I'm giving you hints about what to put up on Yelp. And so a third good possibility is you leave today and you say, I came to realize I don't understand what I thought I did. That's also a good outcome. It leaves open the need for more studies. And it means that you're doing what God told you to do in Amos 5. Seek God. So if you came in and you thought maybe for the reasons that Greg put up here that you do understand, and now you realize, no, I've only had fallacies this whole time. I need to get understanding. That's good. And we have a lot of resources between now and July. You might say that's a long time to wait. But we've got a lot of resources on my YouTube page, Dr. Owen Anderson. And also our webpage has a blog that we put up articles on about this. So you have resources to follow up on from what we're doing. So we want to figure out, we want clarity about God's existence. And we need an argument to understand. If we don't have an argument, we don't understand. Does that sound controversial at all? So you might say, well, you're telling me my grandma, who's the most pious person I've ever met and makes delicious cookies, doesn't know God and isn't saved. Well, that's a good exercise in careful listening. Because no, I didn't say any of that. You could be saved. That's a whole different question. What gets you saved? I'm not suggesting you need to be an argument to be saved. But if you begin to press back on me and say, well, I think you could be saved without understanding anything at all, that seems a bit odd, right? Like, I don't understand Jesus or any of that stuff, but I'm saved. So what you like about your grandma is, this is a common example. You might not have had it yourself, but it's literally the grandma example that always comes up. And it's never the grandpa example. I think it's because grandma makes cookies, but grandpa's over there drinking grandpa's old cough syrup, right? So they never give the example of grandpa, always grandma. And what I think you're seeing is grandma put her faith into action in caring for her family. But she's not necessarily a teacher, right, who can explain her faith. And that's fine. Not everyone's going to be gifted in that area. But you're seeing her live out her life before you, and that's something that you appreciate, which is good. So your example doesn't prove what you think it does. Maybe what's happened is they take a narrow view of giving an argument. You can give an argument by living your life. That's a kind of argument. But because we're humans, we are asked to explain ourselves, give an account for ourselves. Peter tells us that. Always be ready to give an account. That's at this level. Can you explain why you do what you're doing? Do you understand it? So let's get an argument here. In my book, this is the second chapter, and I use a hypothetical argument, not a categorical argument, which is this. If nothing is clear, then there is no meaning. There is meaning Therefore, it isn't true that nothing is clear or some things are clear. So that's an argument, and we can ask, is it valid? Let me try to rephrase this as the kind of argument I gave you above. You have to technically, you need to use the word is such that it requires clarity. I should have done this ahead of time, so I had it worked out on my mind. So this will give you no thing has or is meaningful. Or it would actually be the opposite. No meaningful thing is clear, or no meaning is a thing. It gets awkward because the categorical syllogisms require the word is. And the English doesn't work out that way here. But nothing with meaning is a thing. All things require meaning. Which is an awkward way of saying nothing is clear, or nothing is meaningful. So the point is, even with the word thing, it is distinguished from non-thing, right? So you couldn't use any word meaningfully if nothing is clear. Nothing you say or do or think would be clear. All meaning presupposes or requires reason as the laws of thought to distinguish between A and non-A, or thing and non-thing, God and non-God. Any example? So what we want to do now, get into a third argument, is zero in on the most basic thing we can say about God. And that's why, let me take you back up here. Showing what is clear about the eternal power of God. That's the part on now. So we see there are clear things, and it's beginning with God being eternal and nothing else being eternal. And this is from general revelation, meaning I'm not appealing to the Bible here to show this to you. I'm simply going to show it to you, or Greg's going to actually give an example, from general revelation. We can know something is eternal. Only God is eternal, without beginning. Only God is eternal. That distinguishes God. Just like understanding distinguishes humans from the animals, eternality distinguishes God from everything else. And it's interesting, that's right where the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That sentence distinguishes God from everything else right away. Only God had no beginning. All other things had a beginning. So the first thing, if someone was to tell you or ask you, oh, you believe in God, what do you believe about God? The first thing, the first place you'd start is in only God's eternal. And right away you've ruled out all polytheism, because an important part of the stories about Zeus or Jupiter is the story about his parents. He had a beginning. Once Jupiter was a little baby. Oh, what a cute little Jupiter. Yes, you are. Tickle Jupiter's little feet. Then he cries, he gets hungry. He grows up to be an absolutely awful God. I mean, he's not even a good human being. let alone a deity you'd want to worship. So right away you've distinguished all those, right? And you've also got into philosophical materialism. Only God is eternal, matter's not. How about your soul? I don't know if you're ever tempted to believe that your soul is eternal, but half the world goes that direction, and maybe more, and it's very influential in our pop culture. I had the awful misfortune of seeing a movie the other day called Matrix Resurrection. And this was at least hinting towards this idea, it could easily be drawn out of it, that you didn't have a beginning. You've always existed. You're in this framework. True reality is consciousness. And consciousness creates all other things. You are God. That was the lie from the beginning. And it continues to today. So that's why we're going to look at these two today. Matter's not eternal, and you're not eternal. Now, you might settle that very easily by looking at your driver's license. See, date of birth. I had a beginning. Well, it's not referring to that. It's referring to your consciousness. That you're made of the stuff of God. You're God. So that's what we're going to look at and say, no, both of those are wrong. Only God is without beginning. And we can know this with certainty. It's clear. That's what we want to have in an argument. And because it's clear, ignorance is without excuse. Culpable ignorance. It's interesting because a lot of times it seems that people think you're only guilty if you know it and don't do it. And so a lot of Christian apologists actually spend time proving that everybody already knows God, even though the Bible clearly says they don't know me. Because they think you have to have this component, they know it and don't do it. But most of our law breaking is culpable ignorance, not that other kind. And you'll go before the judge and you'll say, Judge, I didn't even know it was wrong. And does that matter to the judge? Doesn't matter. You're still guilty. Now you're actually doubly guilty. You don't even know the law. It does work in some areas where the judge would agree it's overly complicated, which is usually like taxes. So you can get out of certain tax problems. You're not forgiven the money, but you're just not sent to jail because you say, yeah, this is really complicated stuff. The judge can say, yeah, it is. You still owe the money though. But stuff like speed limit, will that help you? Go there and you say, hey, speed limit. I don't know. I didn't even know the speed limit was a school zone. Murder. I knew murder was wrong, but I didn't know that was a human. That'll get you out of it. I can't distinguish humans from non-humans. Won't get you out of it. Culpable ignorance. So because it's clear, you're without excuse. Now, so let's have Greg come up and tell us now an argument to show something is eternal.
Okay, so something is eternal. Why are we starting here with this concept of eternal? Well, we would say that the concept eternal is our most basic concept. And going back to the argument, this is what we would put into an argument as a term, okay, or a word or a phrase. So this is a concept that will come together with other concepts in a judgment. So the cat is black, right? Cat concept, black concept, joined together in affirmation. Or the cat is not black, denied of the cat, right? And then that forms into an argument. We're going back to, again, not argument, not judgment, but concept. So why are we looking at eternal as the most basic concept? Well, I believe that we can identify what is most basic when we distinguish between foundation and what's built on foundation, or what has the fewest assumptions. Something's going to be more basic than another if it has fewer assumptions. And the thing that has no assumptions is going to be the most basic concept. So if we think about anything that we look at, observe, think about that thing. Does it depend on other concepts? Is it complex? Can it account for itself? Can I account for myself? Well, I can account for myself in and of myself if I'm eternal. I'm self-existing. I don't have to refer to some other being to explain my being. Or if I don't change. Well, none of those are true of me. And all of those things are true of what's eternal. So by eternal, as a concept, we're saying that this has no beginning. And that's distinguished from what? What has a beginning. And here we're going to use, you could say, non-eternal, right? Very clear contradictory term. Or temporal. Temporal is what has a beginning. And so, as a square cannot be a circle, and a circle cannot be a square, they're contradictory terms, contradictory concepts. If you were to think about a circle being a square, you identify that they're mutually exclusive. They might transform into one another. You might somehow misperceive a circle and think that it's a square, and then you suddenly become aware that it's a circle. But they are not the same thing. So a circle has no points, it has no sides, and yet a square is defined in those terms. So a circle on its perimeter, all points on the perimeter are equal in distance to the point, and a square cannot possibly, logically, be that way. In that same way that we know that there cannot be a square circle, and you could go on YouTube and see all the fools put up their party tricks and try to show that there's a square circle. We know that eternal and temporal cannot be combined. They're contradictory. And so when we think about showing that something must be eternal, we're going to consider what would be the contradiction of reality that would say that which is eternal, yeah, there's no such thing. Everything had a beginning. So that which has no beginning is most basic, and here I'll add to that, it's most basic because it's independent. And three qualities show that it's independent. The first is that it's self-existing. Nothing else gave it existence. The second is that it's self-maintaining. Nothing else is having to uphold that, keep it going. And then because it's self-existing and self-maintaining, it's self-explaining. And so we can begin to think about the things that we engage with and ask whether or not what we think is eternal has these qualities and characteristics. But what if nothing had those qualities and characteristics? So this is going to be an argument showing, so say you're going to seminary and Jonathan Edwards is your professor, and he says, show something must be eternal. Or maybe John Locke. Dr. Anderson just did some videos on John Locke, and it's good. It's really good stuff. Okay, so show that something must be eternal. Well, step one, we're going to consider what if nothing is eternal? Probably write out the words. If So this is a hypothetical. If nothing is eternal, then the arrow is going to point us to what we should be inferring. Okay? All is what? If nothing is eternal, and there are only two kinds of existence, that which has no beginning and has a beginning, conceptually, then all will be temporal. Excuse me. It's temporal. Now, I'm going to not notate each step with numbers, but there should be, I think, about 7 steps. So if all is temporal, now from all is temporal, based upon the definition, what can we infer? If all is temporal, then all has a beginning. Or let's say had. Okay, if all had a beginning, then we can be maybe a bit more precise with that. How did it have a beginning? Well, it came into being. If all had a beginning, then all came into being. Do you see any problems yet? Anything that someone might stumble over? Well, think about it. Hold on to questions or objections if you have them. So all came into being. Then what can we infer? At some point, there was nothing. So have you ever heard this question, why is there anything at all? So we can have all of these questions about life, but why is there anything at all? Atheists like to throw this out. Why is there anything at all? At some point there was nothing. Well, where does that leave us? At some point there was nothing. If at some point there was absolute nothingness, but now we know something exists. And you might say, well, I don't know that the material world exists. Okay, fine, but you're a thinker. And so you might say, well, I'm part of Brahman, or maybe I'm part of Maya, the illusion, and Brahman is distinct from me, but you're saying that there's being. No matter what tradition you're coming from, philosophically, theologically, if you're coming to this place and seeing that there is something, but given the original assumption, nothing is eternal, you have being, but there was nothing, then being came from non-being. So if nothing is eternal, then being came from non-being. How's that? Do we good with that? As we approach things, I really enjoyed and was convicted by that first session this morning, thinking about the foolishness in our hearts. We have two ways that we need to think about this. We need to think logically, but we also need to think existentially. Many times we're focused on maybe one side or the other. We need to engage with what unbelief is propositionally, but we also need to look at how unbelief behaves and what comes out of unbelief. The person who would say being can come from non-being, do they live that way? And what would that look like? We have distinctions, God and non-God, man and non-man, good and non-good. And we ought not have these these lack of integrity, right? If you're going to say that being came from non-being, then you need to have integrity in that. You're forming an argument and coming in opposition to what I'm stating. In that argument, are you linking each piece and you want to arrive at a conclusion, each premise, and you want to arrive at a conclusion? If being can come from non-being, what are the implications epistemologically when we're forming arguments, when we're trying to make distinctions, draw inferences? So just, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit there, or behind, backward, but we do want to look at the existential in as much as we're looking at the logical. And so if someone were to say, yeah, being can come from non-being, we really need to pause and think, are we engaging with someone who really wants to know the truth? Who really is seeking life and wants to have that life in their life, okay? So if nothing is eternal leads to being came from non-being, yes?
Could you also rephrase being from non-being as an uncaused event?
Yeah.
Like, would that be, okay.
Yeah. So if being came from non-being, that is,
Essentially, an event from a non-event, or an uncaused event. So someone who believes that would believe in uncaused events, and there's really no way to live like that.
yeah, you may think of free will as an uncaused event, where you're not recognizing the role of beliefs,
Like a libertarian
free will.
extremist. Yeah.
Yeah, or you may do that at the cosmological, ontological level, which we're engaging with here at some level. What if cosmologically, ontologically, getting beyond just what we perceive, what if, not order in as much as just saying, what if being, period, didn't exist at all? There were no beings, and then beings came about. So if nothing is eternal, uncaused events, I hope I didn't belabor that too much, but I really wanted to, again, think about the person who's maybe going to claim this, and how do you proceed in discussion with them, because you don't want to engage in a foolish argument. It's not going to be good for you, it's not good for them, it's not good for the people around you, so careful about that. Then what should we conclude here? Being from non-being is logically impossible. Therefore, the original nothing is eternal. That original proposition is false. And something is eternal is true.
Arguing in a circle?
What's that?
Is that arguing in a circle?
So here we're beginning again with contradictions. So think of the square of opposition. Yeah, square, not a circle. Yeah. So here we could map statements. So here is your A and your E and your I and your O that you can learn about in the logic class on General Revelation Institute. Okay.
I vaguely remember.
Okay. And here, this statement, nothing is eternal, will fit here under your E. And this statement, something must be eternal, is going to fit here in your I. And so these are by nature contradictions. Okay. And so this contradiction isn't arguing in a circle in as much as, say, I just hand you a gift, and it's wrapped in beautiful paper and a bow, and you just carry that around with you all your life, right? Is that what you do? No, you open it up. You want to know what's inside. Yeah. So that's what we're doing. We're saying, what's inside? What does this statement actually mean when we have the integrity to think through what's inside? And what we're saying is that when you unwrap it, it means being came from non-being. So not arguing in a circle in as much as just what was actually contained in the initial statement proposition.
And what it leads to.
Yeah.
Back to.
Yeah.
Essentially, because you can, with the contradiction, if E is true, I must, or if E is false, I must be true. So by proving
Right.
E is false, you can conclude I is true.
Yeah. Yeah. So here, this statement becomes false in as much as a square circle is not possible. This is not possible. And because that's false, its contradiction must be true. But we don't know yet, we're going to continue investigating, but we don't know yet. The A statement would be all is eternal. It could be that all is eternal. Everything, when you look at it as a whole or the individual parts, does exist in itself. It's just always existed. You're dust, you're stardust, right? You think yourself a person. You think yourself a spiritual entity, right? Have personhood, let's say, right? But really you're just stardust. And you exist in yourself as stardust. And the universe keeps itself maintained. And you look at it and it's just self-explaining. You don't have to refer to some other entity, a deity, that brought it about. It's just always been. It's what always has been, is, and ever will be. Right? So, we don't know if that might be true. And we don't know if it might be true that some is not eternal. And I'd say most in this room probably fall into this. So you're going to have, this cap is really on there. You're going to have down here the belief in God the Creator. So you're going to have any branch of theism is going to fall under here. So you might go to different branches of theism and you might find out, oh no, we actually believe that we're part of eternal substance. And so was God. And as he is, we will be. As we now are, he was, right? And so you can work through the belief system of an individual, even when they might use our language as a theist, right? What do they actually believe? And they may end up either material monist, spiritual monist, dualist, something in there, where we're identifying what is eternal, what's self-existing, is it matter, is it spirit, is it some combination of the two? And you can go all the way back in history through Dr. Anderson's lectures and look at Plato and who are some of the others that you've looked at recently, Aristotle, and all the way up to Locke and Vermigli, right? So got some extra time. I don't know if you want to, yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Being from non-being is not logically possible, because your argument was from before was existentially it couldn't be lived out, right? You can't really have integrity with it. But what do you mean to say that it's logically impossible? Is it just the same as because it can't be existentially lived, therefore it can't be logical, or?
I think it would not be it would not be existentially possible because it's not logically possible.
Okay, so can you elaborate on that piece then?
Yeah.
Yeah, so should we spend, I don't know, billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get to the dark side of the moon, that side that we never see? Should we try to get to that side to find out if there's a square circle? Of course not, because there's no square circle. It's not logically possible, and therefore we know that it can't exist.
Right, but how is being from non-being logically impossible? Because I can't conceptualize a square circle, right? And so in that sense I can say, okay, so that's going to be a logical impossibility. But I can imagine, right, the great gazoo just appearing here in the corner, right? Just uncaused. Because I can imagine it, it doesn't seem to fit in the same way as a square circle.
It's like a different kind of logic. It's kind of
Yeah, so notice
Oh, yeah,
here,
it's a bit deeper with that.
it would be different. But here in the proposition, what we're saying is we can state the proposition. I could imagine something popping into my perceptual field. Where it came from, I don't know. But that it came from nothing, that doesn't normally appear in.
Right, but
in
I can still
because I-
conceptualize that.
You just conceive that it just came into existence
Yeah.
out of nothing?
Right. I can't conceive of a square circle appearing,
Right. Exactly.
but a flower
Because
pot
you,
appearing.
because you can't perceive a square circle.
Right, but I
Exactly.
can perceive something appearing.
So just a unicorn pops up
Sure.
here and sits in the chair. And so you're then inferring that, oh, I can perceive it, and so it could logically be possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe a unicorn popping into the room and sitting in the chair might be one thing. And I'm going to say maybe between that and square circle is nothing is eternal. We're saying nothing is eternal when we actually open it up and conceive of what would what would it mean ontologically? That is being and non-being as distinct concepts. What would it mean if I were to say nothing is eternal? Well, then coming down here, being came from non-being. I'm actually saying being is being. Because if non-being can give rise to being, then it's not different than being.
One thing
Yeah.
that I found sometimes, like, in my head, it's a little more easier because you think of non-being, bringing about being as an uncaused event. An uncaused event is a contradiction because there are no uncaused things that are caused.
Right.
So I think it's just kind of another way of phrasing that, but that's one way I've always looked at it. Kind of. Is, yeah, there's no uncaused. It's a contradiction, so you can't have it. It's not logically possible.
So, can I clarify? So you're saying, so non-being would be like the non-A, and then being is A. So what this ends up saying by the end is that the end, the non-being is the being. That's what you're saying, and that is what we can't have. We can't call non-being being, or non-A A. So it, it's kind of nullifying the law of identity. And that's why this doesn't work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we're getting back to epistemology. If the concept of being is not the same as non-being, and we're committed to that, then when we get to this point, and it says, no, in reality, being came from non-being, that is non-being caused being, then we've got a problem.
So is then the logical error to conceive of non-being as a state at which things were? To say that at one point there was being, and then before that was non-being, that I'm attributing some sort of ness to non-being?
Yeah.
That's what I'm calling non-being being, and that's where the collapse is happening?
Yeah.
Okay.
Violence.
So in causation, right, this is going to come up with Hume. You can't depend upon causation, right? It's not, but then when you begin to think about thought, causation isn't something that you prove, it's something that is built into your thinking, right? So it's proceeding from the laws of thought, that when you have being, you need a necessary, you have to give a sufficient explanation of it. Now, it might come from itself, but if it can't come from itself, then it has to come from something else. And so if being now is, and we're trying to account for being, but you say that it had a beginning, right? It had a beginning, then we try to attribute the cause of its being to non-being. That's where
Or that before that being was non-being, and so I'm attributing some sort of quality to non-being when non-being conceptually would have no qualities.
Dr. Anderson, do you want to
Yeah, let me wrap up this segment with that.
give any feedback on that? Maybe?
Yeah, I mean, what you're getting at is part of the problem of even thinking about non-being. Because even when you start to say, non-being is whatever you say after that,
Yeah.
here you have a contradiction
Yeah.
with the word is and non-being. Because the word is the same as being, right? It's a conjugated form of.
Right, I'm predicating something to it.
So our most basic concept is or being. Any sentence you have, you use that concept. The table is over there. The lights are, which is a form of is, on, right? So that's our most basic concept. And our most basic distinction is being and non-being. These have nothing in common, right? So if you were to say, well, eggs come from non-eggs, chickens are non-eggs, so why can't you have being from non-being? That's okay. You get A from non-A. Well, this is a different kind of A and non-A. This is the most fundamental A and non-A. These two have something in common. Eggs and chickens are both beings. You're getting being from being. If you say that being can come from either being or non-being, then you've said that these aren't distinct. Right? That's where you get your contradiction. Being can come from both being and non-being. And then the contradiction, I'll put like this, the next thing's contradicting that. Being and non-being are distinct in all ways. Those two sentences are contradictions. And I think this is actually more fundamental than the uncaused event thing. The reason why there aren't uncaused events is because of this. So when you imagine the great kazoo popping into the corner of the room, and you say, well, I'm imagining not kazoo, and then kazoo, is that his name?
Gazoo.
Gazoo? Let me use a more common example that I'm particularly fond of. Gandalf and non-Gandalf, right? There's no Gandalf in the room, and now there is Gandalf in the room. Well, that's still being from non-being. I mean, being from being. A room, and then there's another being in the room. Right? You're not getting being from non-being. So that example doesn't address this contradiction here. These are fundamentally different. It's interesting to see, I mentioned, we'll close with this, pop culture stories illustrate Greg's point. And this heinous movie, The Eternals, which is about how the stars recycle themselves. So it's pagan polytheism versus materialism, in the sense that the stars are personal beings, and there's a little egg called Earth, planets that have little baby stars in them that grow up and pop out and turn into a star. So it's doing what all the old pagan systems did, which is put a person involved rather than just forces. But the materialist says the same thing now, just with physics. Given these physical properties, stars have to recycle themselves. So that's just pop culture version of saying there is no God. They're just stars recycling themselves. So that's a good example of what Greg was talking about. So does that help there, Corey, those contradictions?
Yeah.
All right. Now, what all of that gets to is a simple point, which we're going to keep doing in our last segment. If you understand what eternal, you understand what being means, you would never say being comes from non-being. That's a fundamental mistake of understanding, and there's no excuse for that. The word I use the most is, or being, I don't even understand. talk about meaninglessness. Next, we're going to go to, okay, something's eternal. In fact, every religion agrees, every philosophical system agrees to that. But what is it? And so today we're going to look at two things. But there's really 12 arguments. So this is all just a cliffhanger to get you to rush onto Amazon and purchase a book. That's what all this was. It's like one of those TV seminars. Yeah, TV seminars. So I'm only silly about that, but I'm saying this because Greg and I aren't suggesting that after this we've shown that full definition of God. What we've been doing is adding pieces to that definition. And the purpose of those 12 arguments is not only that definition of God, but also to get us to our need for Christ, which I taught about in the first segment. So let's take our break and then we'll come back. Segment. Now, this has been called an intensive because we're doing a lot in one morning. And we're recording it so people who can't be here can look at it, but also so that if you wanted to go back over the information and remind yourself, it'll be available. We'll put that on YouTube, but I'm also going to put it, if you just want audio, I'm going to put it on my podcast. I have people tell me, YouTube, that takes up too much of their battery. Can you just do audio stuff? So I have a podcast that's on Apple, Spotify, Anchor. I'll link that on our webpage so you can get to it easily. And then you can just hear the audio if you want. And we're going to put up these notes so you can follow them. So now we're going to turn to this truth. Whatever is eternal is also unchanging. That's a truth about what's eternal. Nothing that's changing can be eternal. Now, let me describe change real quick. If someone says change is cyclical, what is happening now has always happened and will happen again, this isn't really changing. They're actually denying the reality of change by saying that no, this has already happened. When we speak about change, we mean one-time development in the being. So think about changes in your life. You graduated college. Well, your BA in philosophy. No, you did something useful. Business. And you might get another BA later, but you don't ever get a BA in business again, right? And that had measurable things. I needed 120 credits. 50 of them had to be in the business college. And I checked those off semester after semester until I got all of them. That's change. If you've already achieved a BA in business and then you do it again, that's not really change. And you do it again then in the future. So the cyclical view of change is really just denying change. And we have arguments looking at that as well, which we're not going to do right now. We're looking at changes like this. Could it be the case that matter, which is changing, is eternal, and it's changing in the real sense of change? Not simply it's recycling itself. We've already done this before, which is what you might find out in the new Doctor Strange movie. This is going to be real change. The earth develops, burns out, and goes away. And it's been doing that from eternity. After eternity, the earth burned out. Or what will happen is it'll get absorbed into the sun. Right? So we're going to look at that now and see, could that kind of change, which we're going through, be eternal? And then you'll notice what people do. There's two options. One option is to say, I guess you're right. The earth was created. We should look to see about God. The other option is to say, well, that's because that kind of change is an illusion. It's all a cycle. So they'll go further from God. So, all right.
Yeah, so the way I am thinking about this is to state from the forefront of this argument, there are no unique events with an eternal being or process, right? When we speak about change, we mean a one-time development in the being. So if something's eternal, it can't change. It's tied up with this idea of unique events. So if we say, what exists, remember existence being the most basic concept, we can ask, well, has that, let's say the marker, has this marker always existed or did it begin to exist? Is that more basic than its color? So we get to more basic concepts, most basic concept that of existence, that of being, right? Something existing. And we ask, what if nothing was eternal? And then the next step, so what we're doing is we're proceeding, we're not proving God's existence from, like, you know, one sentence, here I proved it for you. This takes seeking, it takes diligence, it takes a mind to want to know this being because it's the source of life, it's the source of meaning and love and all those great virtues that proceed from that being are something that should cause us to think and want to say, yeah, well, how do I know that? How do I know that that reality has proceeded from this being, the reality that I see? So one objection that we'll have, if we go back to that square that I introduced just a bit ago, is this idea that all is eternal. And where I'm abbreviating ET, just eternal. So, if you say, well, God the Creator exists, you might not know or have given much thought to the idea that all is matter, or as we'll see in the last half of this hour, all is spirit. But when you say God exists, that's excluding those worldviews. And so you ought to be able to show, maybe witness, give an account of what exists by showing that, yeah, this idea of all is matter and matter is eternal is false. So this is materialism or material monism, that is one substance. There is no spirit. So material monism, all is eternal and all is matter. So we have, in my classes, I have this displayed in this way. So you have matter and you have spirit, and then you have eternal and temporal. And what's eternal here is matter. There is no spirit. And what about temporal? There's nothing temporal, right? So you're just joining matter and eternality here. So if, let me use the green. I don't know how red's showing up. Distinguish the argument here. If matter, I'm tempted to abbreviate. If matter is eternal, then could we say that it would be independent? It's eternal. It has not gotten its being from something else. It's independent of all other being by being self-existing. Now, if we can say it's independent, it's self-existing in and of itself, we know in that respect we're not going to have to go to something else to explain that it exists. But what about its being? Is it maintained in its being? Let's say the universe is eternal. All is matter. The universe is eternal. Is the universe maintained in its being throughout eternity? So as Dr. Anderson was presenting, we might say, well, maybe it's a cycle. Like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, we just see the universe banging and imploding and banging and imploding, and we just get this in and out cycle through all eternity. Or maybe we conceive of it in some other way, but is change an illusion? Is all changes an illusion? Is the fact that I'm right now trying to persuade you of my belief and we're engaging in a dialogue, Is that an illusion? I ought not to want to try to convince you of something if you can't change. So when we're thinking through this argument, we need to identify what are the existential implications of it. But if matter is eternal, then it would be self-maintaining. Oh, see, I did it. I went and abbreviated. Matter, second premise. Premise 1, premise 2. Matter is not self-maintaining. Therefore, matter is not eternal. Again, going through the logic course would be helpful. It only compounds the meaning that can be grasped as we're going through this. You see the way that the premises relate to one another. By denying the consequent, there's a relationship here where we see if we deny the consequent, matter is not self-maintaining, we're showing the antecedent also to be false. Okay? So if, again, in plain language, if something eternal always comes with this thing, and we don't have this thing, then it's not eternal, right? So if matter is eternal, matter is self-maintaining, matter is not self-maintaining, matter is not eternal. What do you see as a problem here? Is that end of story? All the materialists are convinced and we go home? No, we have to give support for the second premise. Do we have support for that? How do we know that it's not self-maintaining? So as we think about the universe, I think we're thinking about a system, okay? Broadly speaking. All that's within that system is interconnected, related, okay? And what we see when we observe the system are extremes. Would a materialist agree to this? All is matter, matter is eternal. It's all a system. We can observe extremes. Hot, cold. You have throughout the heavens. All of this is displayed. You have stars in the heavens. The heavens declare the glory of God. You have concentration of heat. You have some concept of coldness when you just look at the dead, dark space, right? So these extremes are in a system, and therefore the extremes interact. Hot and cold come into contact with one another. You open the fridge. It's probably plugged in, so it'll stay a little bit cooler, but the kid doesn't shut the door, and after a few days, stuff's gonna start to spoil more quickly, right? So you have to teach the kids to close my dad was, growing up here in Phoenix, it's like every time I would go through the door, close the door, right? Because you've gotta spend something to replace that thing that's being lost or compromised, right? So when you have a lot of heat and a lot of cold and those things interact, what happens? Well, they can come to sameness. And then what happens after sameness? Sameness. And then what happens after sameness? Right? So we look at the universe as a whole. We don't have to get into the elements of modern day astrophysics. Right? Cosmology. We just simply think about what it is that the universe itself is a system. So this is general revelation. I think this is a general sense of which we can look at the heavens, and it's not difficult to think through this. And so we're culpably ignorant. We have no excuse for not recognizing, and yet we've bowed ourselves down to them. Perhaps, you know, I'm just a mutt. I've got so much blood from so many different nations probably. I mean, I'm sure my ancestors have sacrificed children, right, within their cultures. And sacrificed these children to gods that may be, you know, identified with worship. Well, we don't worship today, do we? The materialists don't think of themselves as worshiping the stars. What do they give their attention to? What are they sacrificing resources for? So we need to be thinking about how that's connected. We might also say, if we look at the sun in particular, this is a part You can look at stars or the sun in general and think about what the sun is. Think about what's happening. It's I think it's converting hydrogen to helium, something like 600 million tons a second, I think. Something like that. It's crazy. Whatever it is. It's insane. And yet it's a cooler star, right? And so in the sun, what can we observe? The sun is giving off heat, right? We know from the earliest days of our existence as humans that it's giving off heat. It's not difficult to observe. All of our plant life that the animals eat, and then we're either eating plants or animals, that comes from that, right? So we're consuming it, and then we recognize life is coming from that heat, and then we might easily bow down to it. The sun is giving off heat. Actually, I'm sorry, I missed a step here. Let me, the sun is limited in size. I'll say that if we're thinking what that represents is it's got limited resources. I'm sorry for running in here. I'll try to get to the typing for our next time together. But sun is limited in size. Sun is giving off heat. What does that mean? It's using resources. So if it's limited in resources and it's using the resources, then what? It's going to burn out. Sun will burn out. So we see here two ways. You might say, well, this isn't getting into the modern day science. It's not capturing that idea at that level. Really? Because I think what's happening here is we've already drawn the sword and the enemy is dead. And they know it. And they're fleeing away. And so now we have to go chase them down. Right? So I think that everyone can notice this. But as Dr. Anderson mentioned, especially intellectuals might have all their ways to find workarounds and make distinctions where there really is no distinction, obfuscation, right? To get out of making the inference that is so blatantly obvious here, right? So when we think about this next step, we can see that. So say you've got this idea of Big Bang. Are we saying that that's not the way that it happened? Well, God made the bang, right? He's the one who said, let there be an expanse. So there was light, there was an expanse, and so we see this expanse created in the heavens. And as a whole, when we look at the universe, why couldn't it be that we see a sort of recycling event? And I'll try to get this in 1 minute because Dr. Anderson's got to come up for spiritual monism. And this is the only, this is just the first piece. So this is an immersion, but there's a lot that's missing. And so I hope that this is helpful to just get us started. So why couldn't it?
Also, Greg, you might just point out to it also, though, is denying the kind of change we were just talking about. So that's a whole different cyclical view. Because they're saying the universes have always happened and will always happen.
Right. Yeah, so we already see here changes, they're conceding to that it's changing. But maybe it's an illusion. How will that play out? You might have to, I guess, talk to the individual. Bertrand Russell was brought up. Natadiva.
Just go with Tony.
I didn't want to go the easy way. Tony was mentioning Bertrand Russell before class this session and wondering why didn't he see it? He was involved in some of the formulation of logic that we use now and some use. And as we think about his life, he said if he would come up to God, he'd say there's not enough evidence. It's at least what we hear through the grapevine that he may have said. Well, he is going to say that the universe is going to die a heat death. It is going to have a final end. It's not going to cycle back here. It's going to have a final end as a dying a heat death. And yet he did not then infer that God must exist. Why? Because he wasn't seeing the connection between what's eternal and what's self-maintaining. The universe is not self-maintaining, and so it's not eternal, but something must be eternal. It's not a hard sell, right? So I'm going to actually have to leave you hanging, because he's got to have enough time to do his bit. So, why could the universe not, be eternal? Continue to think on it, and we'll work together.
And that's part of the nature of intensive, right? You're being introduced to a lot of material today with the goal of wanting to learn more. Imagine if we ended today and said, now you know all you need to know. You're done. That'd be terrible. It'd be bad news. All right, so the same thing here now, using the same insight. And we'll actually probably also come back to a cyclical thing, so hopefully we'll help answer that question is, could I have existed from eternity with no beginning? Now, obviously, the I here is my consciousness, not my body. Because everyone will say, yeah, I had a birthday. But the consciousness always existed and has existed from eternity. Well, we know that whatever is eternal is without change. But I am changing. And changing in the sense defined above, right? I got my high school diploma, got my college degree, got a master's degree, got a PhD, became a professor, became an associate professor. You go through all these for each of us. We all have events in our life like that. You can't imagine saying that about God. Hey, did you guys get an invitation to God's graduation party? He's getting his 1000th PhD. Doesn't make what are we talking about, right? God is already knows all there is to know because God's eternal. Whatever is eternal knows everything already. Or I'll phrase it a few different ways. So the relevant property for consciousness or a mind is knowledge, understanding. So here's an argument. If I am eternal, then I would have all knowledge. I don't have all knowledge, therefore I am not eternal. So you see the argument. Now you can ask, is this true? Well, I think each of us in here would probably say so. But there are some who would say, no, I know everything, I just forgot it. Let me actually list these. So responses. I know everything, I just can't remember. My true self knows everything, but my illusory self does not. Something could be eternal and still learning. Takes a lot of time. Those are the possibilities, I think, of objections to this. So let's go with this one first. After eternity, say responses to responses. If, after eternity, you still don't know, you will never know. You understand why? Like, imagine, take it out of the abstract, put it to the practical. And you come into a class, and the syllabus tells you, how long will this class take? More than eternity. After eternity, you still won't have passed this class. Would you take the class? I mean, I guess you would if you don't care about passing it, right? You're not moving on to, I'm taking this class to get a raise at work. Okay, well, after eternity, you still won't be done, which means after eternity, you won't have a raise. Well, you wouldn't. It's not a possible class, right? So that's why I say whatever can be known is known by what's eternal. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression that it's because God hit the books really hard. He's hitting the books from eternity and studying hard, and now he knows things. That's part of the idolatry that comes up in thinking of God as if he's like us. We'll find out that God knows things as creator. He made them that way. So he knows them uniquely, but we're just throwing a problem in this other view also. And then what about my true self? My true self objection concedes that I am not eternal. Because see, yeah, my illusory self isn't eternal. It's just saying there's some other self that's me. There can't be some other self that is you. And so you can look at, well, what about the dream analogy, or what's it called when you, amnesia? Right, so I'm dreaming, and in my dream I thought that I went to Alaska and was fishing for salmon, but I was really in bed. And so they'll say, this is like that. No, that's not like that at all. In my dream, I was dreaming I'm a finite philosophy professor, but in reality, I'm infinite and in bed, sleeping. The infinite doesn't sleep. The infinite can't be fooled about something. The infinite can't be mistaken about their identity. So it can't be your false self and God that is your true self. And the same with amnesia, which is getting us to this first one I wrote down. My true self is infinite, but I forgot. It's like you ask someone, do you know everything? And they say, no, I really can't tell you. I don't know. Well, then you don't know one thing at least, right? I don't know everything. I might know everything. I'm just not sure. So, how can the eternal, infinite self forget or be under an illusion? It gets to Greg's point that what's eternal is self-existing. You forget because you're not self-existing. You didn't get enough sleep. You didn't have a good breakfast. You're aging and getting brain plaque growing in between the neurons. Have you seen that? And you'll have to learn how to keep your brain clean to avoid Alzheimer's. That can't happen to what's eternal. And I had someone say, well, what if you forget that you forgot? You just keep forgetting over and over from eternity. Like a cycle of forgetfulness. You're having incorrigible memory lapses. Well, then you're not self-maintaining. You're not eternal. So you're really questioning this premise we already had up here. Whatever's eternal is without change. You have to start at the very beginning. If you don't get the beginning pieces right, you'll stumble at the later pieces. And so a lot of times when you hear objections, it's because they're stumbling at, they didn't get earlier pieces in place. And so this raises a problem for any kind of reincarnation system. Think about how the system works. Someone will say, reincarnation is hopeful because I get more than one chance to get it right. Well, it's worse than that. Reincarnation says that after eternity, you still haven't gotten it right. Is that hopeful? Like, you failed 101 infinite times, but have hope because you can try again. No, instead, if it is clear, you only need one opportunity. You only need one life. You can't blame life and say, well, it's just not clear. But that really is what all this boils down to. We've covered a couple arguments to get to our definition of God, but there's more needed. Right? An intensive was meant to introduce you to the material and encourage you to go further. And that's not simply with us. I mean, we're providing a lot of this material for free with the hope that you would continue doing that. But what the Psalms encourage us to do is to seek God. Not seek God with General Revelation Institute only. But whatever you do, seek God. Get to know more about God. And remember that requires knowing your need for redemption in Christ, which is one we didn't get to. That's the 12th argument of the 12, is why we need redemption. So we've done that, and we've also seen why we need arguments, and what are arguments, and why it must be true that some things are clear, and that this clarity begins with what is eternal. From there, we could go on to what's clear about ourselves and what's clear about what is good for ourselves. Because when we think about this, when we think about the, call it the modern problems in human life, and we want a solution to them, this is called a prescription. Right? If you have an ailment, you go to the doctor, you get a prescription that will cure you. And so we might only vaguely be aware of what our problems are. We might recognize, most people would admit, yeah, my life has some problems. But I'm not, and they might pick out a couple things, but I'm not really clear on what my problems are, which means you won't be clear on what a solution will be. And I think that's where we see the power of God, is in showing us what the problem is and in giving the solution. And to summarize it this way, the problem is that although it is clear God exists and that our highest good is in knowing God through His works, we haven't sought God and don't understand. And this leads to all kinds of other problems in our life. But God does offer redemption, which is accomplished by Christ. And so we haven't just been studying an abstract idea today about proving God exists because we have a relative who we're going to see pretty soon at Easter time for our family meal, and we really want to give them a good argument to prove God exists, to show they're wrong. That's all fun. But it's not really getting to the most important thing for us, which is God is real, God made us, and God made us to have fellowship with Him. And instead we didn't do that. We sought other things. We didn't love God. But we're offered redemption in Christ, which is why to know God requires knowing Christ and having fellowship in Christ. And so we encourage you to take this material as a matter of life and death before God. We presented to you the Psalms, Gospels, general revelation, and this is a matter of life and death in coming to know who God is and being able to have fellowship with your Creator. Fellowship that, although it had been broken through not seeking God, is restored by Christ. Now, we have some time at the end for questions. I'm hoping you have some for me.
I do.
Yeah.
It's related to what you said, Greg. So you
Go
can
ahead.
answer or- I get the statement that there are no unique events in eternal being. How does that apply to, namely, the historical event of the birth of Jesus Christ?
So that's the,
That was one question I had.
yep. How does this apply to God acting in history, such as the incarnation?
Thank you.
Hmm?
Better stated.
So, well, here's how it works. Answer. Jesus of Nazareth had a beginning. Right? We celebrate that in December every year. The Son of God had no beginning. So the doctrine of Christ is that he is both God and man, not one or the other.
Right.
So no one's saying that the Son of God had a beginning in Nazareth, in the manger.
But you did,
Part of the problem for a unique event in an eternal being is, why didn't it happen sooner? So, for instance, with the sun, they say, the scientists say it will last, say, 25 billion years, right? So if it has existed from eternity and hasn't burned out, why didn't that happen sooner? 25 billion is less than eternity, right? So when we then apply that to God, acting in history, it doesn't translate. Why didn't God part the Red Sea sooner? Well, that would be out of order, right? Part it when Moses is a baby in the Nile, that's unhelpful. Part it later when Jesus is alive and Moses and all the Israelites were killed by the Egyptians and there'd be no Jesus of Nazareth. So it's not an act in God. This is not a change in God. But a logical order of events. You have to have the parting of the Red Sea before the crossing, logically, made real into temporal events. So the eternal order was always in God's mind. That's eternal. The temporal events are there when Moses gets there and raises the staff. Then it's parted. So you don't say like this, hey, say that happened in 1500 BC, 1499, you say, hey, we should celebrate. Last year at this time, God parted his first Red Sea for the first time after eternity. He finally did it. Isn't that great? Well, that's not how it works. Maybe he'll go on to part more Red Seas. Hope, good for God. Yeah.
Oh, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it, but this is also like, going maybe, because when you think about it, we tend to think of things in that sequential, like, having beginnings in time, because we're temporal beings, but I think part of just thinking of God as an eternal being.
It's a logical order.
Yeah.
That's not temporal.
Yeah, and
It's a logical order you can see all at once. Whereas in a temporal order, you see things unfolding. When we look back at history, we see it all done. The history book's written. But in terms of being in the present, we don't see the future yet. We see it as it hits the present, so to speak.
And God's outside of time in the sense that it's not as if there was some sort of like
Yeah, God's
this
not growing in time.
Yeah, a universe existing. There wasn't any version of this universe like that had existed for eternity, and then
Yeah.
God brought it into existence. There was nothing besides God did He brought it into existence.
Mhm.
So
That's part of what the multiverse is meant to be, rejecting God the Creator. All possibilities really do exist, versus God made this world. So it's another rejection of God in pop culture.
and I guess what I'm trying to kind of phrase, maybe explain is to figure out how to describe it is like it's not as if this. I mean, because this world had a beginning. And there was no way for God to have part of the Red Sea because like the world hadn't brought into existence yet. Sorry, I'm not exactly sure how to phrase what I'm trying to say.
Well, keep thinking about it. I think you had one more question up here.
I'm developing another one.
You got another one too? Well, hey.
But wait.
As you guys are developing them, if you're like me, you'll be driving home and you'll say, "Oh, I just thought of the perfect question." Well, that's good. That's why we have email, right? And follow
I was
us.
about to ask for you,
Yeah.
because I never saw it. I didn't write it down.
So oanders222@gmail.com. And in the subject line, so it doesn't sort it out, like put General Revelation Conference or something so that it doesn't get put into spam. Yeah, because that might happen. You might go home and you think, oh, I have the perfect argument to show what's eternal could change. Right? No, that won't happen. Now, so where are we going from here? So keep an eye on generalation.com schedule and blog for updates about the summer intensive. This was the spring intensive. And then keep an eye on Dr. Owen Anderson on YouTube. For numerous videos. I've got a couple coming out on these pop culture references I've been making because I do movie reviews. But I've also, there's some of them are more like philosophy lectures from my classes. Some of them are more pop culture examples. And then also take one of the GRI online classes at courses.generalrevelation.com.
I remember my other one. The other segment that you were, before we went on break, you mentioned something. You were like, you were advertising, but you were jokingly advertising.
My book?
Yeah. And then it brought to my mind an article I read, I'm sure you've read as well, by Alvin Plantinga, that doesn't show arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah.
And it's been a while since I've read it, so I just wanted to know what your take was on it.
Yeah, that does. I actually have a review. If you look up Owen Anderson, Alvin Plantinga, my review of that book will pop up on Google. I reviewed that for a journal.
We're gonna look at
The approach is very different than what we're doing. It's not the reason I picked 12, but I'm glad 12 and that kind of overlap because what they're doing in that book is saying, here's a bunch of arguments, and most of them are for things like unmoved movers or uncaused events or a designer, and maybe one or two of them is persuasive to you. But they aren't saying what we're saying, which is it's clear from general revelation that God exists. And so they don't take the approach we did, which is we define God. They're okay with like a higher power, whereas we define God, gave this full definition, and then said we can show this definition, although it has parts. So remember, go back up to the definition. One argument is not going to give you all of this.
No.
You'll need about 8 arguments to get all these parts. So that's what we go over in the book. And then there's other arguments. Why we say, well, I thought it was 12. Yeah, we have argument for scripture, argument for the moral law, argument for the highest good. But you need to have arguments for these parts. You don't just say, premise, this. Right? And a lot of times that's what happens. There must be an unmoved mover, and this is what all humans call God. No, that's not this definition of God. So, yeah, I have on my website, drowenanderson.com. I think the review's on there actually. I have all my articles and book reviews. So that's different than the YouTube page. It's funny because when I was doing articles, people told me, you know, can you make videos? I'm always busy doing stuff. I'm working out. And I could listen to your videos. I can't read. I don't have time to read stuff. So I was making a ton of videos. Got hundreds of videos. And literally the other day, someone said to me, "Hey, could you write stuff instead? Could you write it down?" And I'm like, ah.
You can't please everybody.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Hey, Roger, can you email this to yourself? I can't remember my email.
I can't remember what.
My Gmail sign in, so I can't. Or do you have a thumb drive or anything?
I don't, but I could. To deliver?
Where was it, Megan?
It's right there. If it's clear, you only need on opportunity, on the very bottom line, it should say one. It's one of those
Thank you.
that they can't move. Great.
Thanks, guys, have a good day.
Yes, I had Adam.
You know, in high school, you hold notes, there's a certain way where you just hold it and then tuck into itself. It's all small. Theoretically, it's the same shape, we should be able to figure it out. Thanks, Corey.
Your book on Joel, I haven't.
Yeah.